engaging the community since 1970. This is WIS Awareness.
Good morning and thank you for joining us for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. This year, we are marking 150 years since Reconstruction, an era where slaves in the South were discovering their newfound freedom. On Awareness, we have explored treasures in the Midlands that tell stories of that period in history and beyond. We continue to look for other hidden jewels that preserve the past and detail a promising future. Our latest quest took us to the small town of Pinewood. Pinewood is located off Highway 261 in Sumter County. The town used to be called the Clarendon-Fulton Township until it was incorporated in 1899. The name Pinewood comes from the vast number of pine trees throughout the town. About 500 residents live within town limits and a couple thousand on the outskirts. Despite its size, the small town holds a wealth of history. Did you know a Tuskegee Airman taught school in this town? Mr. J. Philip Rembert was one of 3 World War II fighter pilots who lived in Sumter County. Rembert traveled to Pinewood every day to teach at Manchester and Furman high schools. He is recorded to be the first black councilman in Sumter County elected to the at-large seat in 1974. He held that seat until his death in 1987. In a cemetery outside town limits is the final resting place for dozens of veterans, including 7 Confederate soldiers. The Weeks Cemetery was named in honor of James Dixon Weeks, who owned the property. He was a wealthy farmer and well-known slave owner in town. Here is a layout of the Weeks Cemetery as surveyed in 1956. You can see the area labeled Existing Cemetery and underneath it a space labeled Colored Cemetery. The last recorded African-American buried in that section was Mrs. Hattie Brown, who died in 1976 at the age of 104. I sat down with Gary Graham, who grew up in Pinewood, knew Mrs. Brown personally, and has spent years researching the sacred grounds. Mr. Graham, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for coming to Pinewood today.
Well, we are sitting in the Weeks Pinewood Cemetery. A lot of history here. Tell us when this cemetery first came into existence.
People were moving into this area in the very early 1800s, and the Weeks family were some of the first. And shortly after they came here, the older section became the Weeks Cemetery, where their family were buried.
So we have some Confederate soldiers buried here. We have a section of the cemetery where African Americans are buried. How did that separation happen?
The early white cemetery, known as the Weeks Cemetery, contains 7 Confederate veterans. At that time in our history, the African Americans were allowed to be buried just outside of the fence of the white cemetery, and their graveyard faces direct east.
The African Americans were not allowed to be buried within the fence, beyond the fence?
Not at that time. They were all just outside of the fence.
And the area surrounding the cemetery, talk about what that looked like back then.
This was an area that was totally agricultural or timber. One of the local property owners who owned this property, the slave listing for 1860 showed that he owned 59 individuals.
And what was his name?
James Dixon Weeks.
Cemetery named after him. He is buried here. We just saw his grave, and the area, the wooded area that surrounds the cemetery, it was cotton back then.
It was all cotton. Mr. Weeks owned some 1,000 acres. His brother owned 1,000 acres. And another gentleman who basically owned the land where Pinewood was founded, Mr. Dempsey Griffin, owned 700 acres.
And you've been doing a lot of research on this in this cemetery. What are some of the facts you've learned about the history behind this cemetery?
I've always had a big interest in history, and when I was a young man, 16 years old, a lady passed away in town, an African-American woman who everyone called Ma Brown or Mother Brown, and she was buried up here. And it was surprising to me at the time because I did not think African-Americans were buried here. That evening at sundown, my mother brought myself and a lady who helped raise me, was like a second mother to me. We came up and visited her grave at sundown. And at that time, Miss Louise Pack indicated that Miss Hattie Brown was allowed to be buried here because all of her people were buried here. And at that time, looking around, I saw no other graves, but her words were, all of her people are buried here.
And when you look around, you really can't tell that there's anyone else buried in between these two sites.
You cannot. A few years ago, we had an entry road created, and it came very close to the African American section of the cemetery. And at that point, I made the cemetery committee aware that Mother Brown, Miss Hattie Brown, was buried here. And I began to do research. And through contact in Palmer Memorial Chapel, they had excellent, extraordinary record keeping. And they were able to provide me with a funeral card indicating Mother Brown was buried here. From that, I got the date and contacted the Sumter County Library, and one of their research people was able to pull her obituary. And so at that point, I had 2 documents showing that Mother Brown was buried here.
Right, and she said all of her people were buried here too. So were you able to figure out that other graves are here as well?
Through more research, and again, Palmer Memorial helping, I found the death card for her husband, Mr. Wesley Brown, who was buried here in 1948. And from that, began to ask more questions, and a plat surfaced from 1934 indicating that there was actually an African American cemetery here that measures 24 feet by 150 feet, along with another triangular section that is just identified as Section A.
Was there a name for this colored section of the cemetery where these African Americans were buried?
On the early plats, it only refers to it as Colored Cemetery. When it was surveyed in 1997, it was changed to just say Existing Cemetery.
Based on all of your research, knowing the area, being from the area, what does it mean to have unearthed, for lack of a better word, some of the history here and knowing who is buried here?
I'm just happy that we have discovered that this graveyard is as large as it is and can contain 150, 200 people whose lives were spent here and are buried here, and this is their final resting place.
And as far as you know, the African Americans who are buried here in that section, did they work the land?
I'm sure they did. Again, on the slave schedule of 1860, it shows that Mr. Weeks owned 59 people.
Do you know the number of graves that are here, the number of African American graves?
We have not. We only are able to calculate how many it could possibly be. There are no grave markers of any kind, and in my lifetime there has been none.
What is that approximate number?
We're saying 150 to 200 individuals.
Would you like to see some grave markers ultimately for some of these people, or just to signify that there is a cemetery here, there are people buried there?
We would very much like for the cemetery to be recognized, a marker, a monument put in place identifying it as a historic African American burial ground. And we would also like for the current cemetery committee to explore the possibility that the road may cross over some of the graves, and ask them to do the right thing if it does.
And do you have family buried here in the cemetery?
I have family buried in the new section, and I also have family buried in the older section.
Did you know that prior to doing all your research?
I did. My family history has been very well documented since we came into the country in 1719. And fortunately never had to do a lot of research to have my own family history.
That is nice. What would you say to the viewers out there, those who aren't from Pinewood, those who don't know much about this area? What would you say about the significance of this cemetery and this area?
I hope that by finding this cemetery or finding out more about it, that it encourages others to help document and record our histories, both African American and Caucasian. And it's just very important not to let graveyards be desecrated or swept away, because it is someone's final resting place.
Still to come on Awareness.
You know, our children would say, I had the best childhood, and I'm saying, y'all ain't had the best childhood. Y'all was playing Xbox and PlayStation. No, we had the best childhood. Up and down the dirt roads playing with no shoes on. We just had a ball.
Residents remember what it was like growing up in Pinewood. That is next after the break. During our time in Pinewood, we spoke with many residents who were born and raised in the town. They all sang Pinewood's praises, including Chris DeBose. He is in his 80s and now travels back and forth between Pinewood and Charleston. He said, quote, "I love Pinewood. This is my home. Other than Charleston, there is no place in the world but Pinewood, and there are other residents who feel the same way. Take me back to your childhood here, growing up here in Pinewood. What was Pinewood like?
Well, when I grew up as a child in Pinewood, I had really good experiences. We always had things for the kids to do because I was one of those young kids always looking for something to do. We had the Manchester Gymnasium was open during the summertime for the kids to go out there, and there was a program called, I think it was called Feed a Child. And we would go out there and get a lunch, but we would play basketball, football, horseshoes, ping pong, and a lot of different activities. We never sat in the house. We had to get out of the house. And we had the Wateree Community Center, which is right down the street where the new community center is sitting right now. And we had some morning programs out there that a lady by the name of Miss Bracy used to run. And we would be out there from maybe 8 o'clock until 12 o'clock where we would transition. But that was during the summertime. During the fall, even though we went to school, I know for the young boys, we had the football team, Pinewood Lions, and I grew up playing football, but we always had things to do. We always got out the house.
Right. And it seems like everybody was really involved too, with each other and with the community. And tell me about your experiences growing up.
My experience growing up here in Pinewood, matter of fact, we grew up just opposite behind Young's store here. So we walked the town pretty much like we wanted to. You know, our parents, we weren't allowed to be in the house all day. Outside is where we was at. You know, as soon as you get from school, it was take your school clothes off, get the chores done, and go out and play until supper. So we would walk up Pinewood and get together, a group of us, and we just have a good time. There was so many things to do. We had a cotton gin right here. We used to go jump on the bales of cotton and play.
Yeah.
Talk about the makeup of the town. Was it diverse? What did it look like?
I think we always had maybe a little bit more blacks than whites, but everybody got along from my impression when I was young. So, and with that being said, and we just want to keep the town of Pinewood moving forward and everybody come back together again, because we had one of the biggest festivals in the area in which we don't have anything now.
Tell me about that.
The Possum Trot.
The Possum Trot.
Yes.
Okay.
It was the highlight of our little town. People would come from all over to come to the Possum Trot, and the town would be full. They would have rides for the children. It just was an exciting time, and I would really love to see that Possum Trot come back, just so my grandchildren can experience that, you know. As we get older, you know, we have children and then we have grandchildren. We want our grandchildren and our children to experience some of the things that we did. Sure. You know, and you try to tell them a piece of your history, but they don't quite
right, because they're not living it.
Exactly. So it hopes that one day maybe the Possum Trot will come back to Pinewood and put us back in the spotlight, because we was famous for the Possum Trot.
I would add to that the Possum Trot had the town of Pinewood famous. It was rural renowned. Everyone knew about it. Wherever I go now, people ask about it. But in my other capacity, we know that it takes a little more for events like that to happen.
And to sustain them.
Yes, to sustain them, because the funding and the participation to make things happen isn't there right now. But we're going to get there hopefully in the future. Other than that, I thought we had a great childhood. I felt good because Manchester School, I would walk to school every day. Kids were out walking just about everywhere they wanted to go in the little area. We had what we called our little green bus that would come down and take us to Sumter. And nowadays kids would probably shun their nose at something like that, but that was our way if our parents didn't have transportation to take us different places. So, and I often think about things like that, because I guess it made me the person who I am today. When my kids, they automatically needed not needed, but wanted a car in high school, and when I had to take a little bus to get to the next city to purchase things that I wanted.
Right. Well, let's give viewers an idea of where we're situated physically, where we're sitting right now. Talk about the depot and the town.
Well, we're sitting right here, almost in the middle of the town. We have the depot back behind us, which is, and the water tower, which is pretty much one of our center focal piece for the town of Pinewood. Has a lot of history there. I can remember my mother working. It was a company that was in there, and she was working in there. The train used to come through and pick people up, and they'd go to New York, Philadelphia, and Pinewood was a booming town. It really was.
It was a hub of sorts,
yes,
I suppose.
Yes, and they had many manufacturing companies here. We had a big cotton gin here, a big sawmill here, and it was a close-knit town, because I can remember my childhood of growing up that everybody helped everybody child. You know, it was like everybody helped raise everybody child. You know, you got disciplined not just only by your parents, but by somebody else's parents if you misbehaved. And you didn't go back home and tell your parents, because that meant you was gonna get another beating. But anyway,
they probably already knew. By the time
yeah,
you got
but
home.
you know that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that's just how Pinewood was back during that time. You know, everybody took an active part in raising everybody's children. I mean, we all ate at each other's house, spent nights at each other's house. It was just the best time.
When awareness returns, Pinewood is a town with a rich history and one with a bright future. More on discovering Pinewood after the break. What do you want to leave viewers with, knowing what Pinewood is all about, what it means to you?
Well, I would say Pinewood is becoming a more progressive community. We had I moved away. I would say in '82 when I graduated from high school, but I went to college, which was not right in Sumter. So I actually moved away in '87, came back officially in 2011, and over the years, the community, when I first left, the community continued to grow, but it died out because a lot of the manufacturing jobs, just like any other community in South Carolina, they went away, and but that's turning around right now. And with that turnaround that's taking place in Sumter County, which Pinewood falls in, should have a turnaround, and progressiveness should be happening in this area. And I see a brighter day for Pinewood. I see the community coming back together.
What would you say Pinewood is to you?
All of my memories, all of my childhood memories, all of my memories from things that my grandmother, my mother taught my family. All of my family is from around here, so Pinewood means a lot to me. I instill for it to mean a lot to my children. I would hope that Pinewood would continue to grow, or would get back on the urge of growing, and so that we would have things for the children that are growing up now. Because when I look around, the children don't have anywhere to go to shoot ball, to play baseball, to play football. Like Jack said that he was in Little League football, and I remember my brother being in Little League football. The children here doesn't have anything, and I think the community needs to wake up and come together so that we can do things to preserve our history for our children, and that we need to do things that are going to involve our children, because after all, we're all going to leave, but the future is going to be left to our children. So if we don't instill the values in them and do something that's going to keep them in the town, or their roots here in the town, so that if they leave, they're going to come back.
Right, and at least know their history.
And know their history. We always like to say we had the best childhood. And, our children would say, I had the best childhood. And I'm saying, y'all ain't had the best childhood. Y'all playing Xbox and PlayStation. No, we had the best childhood. Up and down the dirt roads playing with no shoes on. We just had a ball.
That was your reality. That's what you remember. That's what you'll always take away with you.
I will always instill that in my children, because I have told them these different stories a million times.
But the good news is we have a brighter future because all the younger folks, they're working again, and they have some of the better jobs in the Sumter area. So they're not living per se in the town of Pinewood, but the community of Pinewood is very vast. As a citizen of Pinewood, we're going to get there. It's just one step at a time if everybody works together.
Yes.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your history and your memories with us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with a final thought. Like Pinewood, every town, city, and community has a history. Parts of that history may not be pleasant, but it's important to acknowledge it and its impact on the present. We need to make sure the stories and the full history are not forgotten, but taught to the generations to come. We want to hear from you and hear about some of your history. Continue the conversation with us on social media. And if you ever miss a show or want to see it again, visit our WIS Awareness Facebook page. Just search Awareness 10. I'd like to thank all of our guests this morning. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.